Altos Labs. The company backed by Jeff Bezos and Yuri Milner set out to do what people have only dared whisper about for decades. They want to turn back the clock inside our cells. That is not poetic language. It means reactivating a handful of genes that steer cell identity and age. They focus on a trick discovered years earlier by Nobel winners. Turn on a few genes, and an adult cell starts behaving like a young one. Researchers call those genes Yamanaka factors. In practice, labs use versions often referred to as OSK to nudge cells toward youth. A study in very old mice delivered those factors systemically using a harmless virus. The mice were 124 weeks old and already frail. After a controlled protocol, the treated group more than doubled their remaining median life, compared with untreated controls. 109% longer was the reported change in remaining lifespan in that experiment. Basically, the intervention reset parts of the cell program, without erasing what made that cell belong to a heart or a liver. Think of it like updating software to a safer version while keeping your files intact. Other teams found chemical mixes that reshape gene activity in human cells in dishes. Work on a gene called NANOG showed that old stem cells can act young again when that switch is flipped. So the core result is simple and unsettling. Age behaves less like a fixed fate and more like a program you can alter. Who controls those updates matters as much as the update itself. The methods did not stop at one success. Researchers tried two approaches that matter for the real world. One used a virus to deliver the gene switches system-wide. The other used small molecules to nudge thousands of genes toward younger patterns. When the viral system was turned on just long enough, it rewired parts of the cell without erasing identity. Hearts, lungs, and muscles showed signs of renewed function. Treated animals moved more easily and resisted diseases that usually come with age. The chemical cocktails worked differently. They do not rewrite DNA. They change which genes are read and how loudly. In human cells in dishes, researchers saw the same youthful patterns return after treatment. Those are technical proofs, but they also answer a deeper question. Are we merely slowing decline, or are we changing the rules that define old and young? The experiment suggests the latter. Age looks like a program with switches and settings. That leads to hard practical problems. Safety is the first. Flip the wrong switch, and a cell can lose control and grow uncontrollably. Regulators and scientists stress careful dosing and safeguards. Access is the second. These are expensive experiments. When private dollars drive the breakthroughs, there is a real chance that the early benefits go first to those who funded the work. Finally, there is a social question that no lab can solve. If aging becomes an engineerable trait, who decides what counts as a fair update and who pays for it? The lab results say, we can change age. The rest is a human choice. Neuralink. A person who cannot speak thinks a sentence, and a machine says it back. That is the promise driving one of the most talked about neurotech efforts, funded by a famous entrepreneur. The basic idea is straightforward on paper. Tiny electrodes read electrical chatter in the cortex. Algorithms learn the patterns that stand for words or intentions. Then, software turns that pattern into a voice cursor or a robotic movement. Research groups offer the proof points. Teams at major universities built systems that decoded intended speech with near-perfect performance in controlled tests. The systems worked with delays measured in fractions of a second and matched what people meant to say nearly every time. Other groups trained models to recognize silent inner speech and reached accuracy levels that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Neuralink and similar efforts do more than restore lost ability. They push toward a world where thoughts can control external devices fast and fluidly. For someone with paralysis, that is life-changing. For everyone else, it raises a darker question. Privacy is not an afterthought. If algorithms can map thought patterns to words, who owns that mapping and who can access it? Consent on a surgical table is not the same as ongoing access in everyday life. The raw data looks nothing like sentences without heavy processing, but the processing is getting better and cheaper. So the technical answer is clear. We can read signals and translate them into action. The ethical and social answer is not decided. Who gets to speak through machines and who gets to listen will shape what programmable reality means for minds. The hardware itself is small and precise. Tiny threads sit on or in the brain and pick up electrical patterns. Those patterns are noisy at first. Engineers train machine learning models to find the hidden signals that stand for a word or an intention. In controlled trials, some systems decoded intended speech with startling speed. Researchers reported near-perfect recognition rates in lab settings when the vocabulary and context were limited. Other teams pushed the frontier further and trained models to interpret inner speech with accuracy levels that surprised many experts. Implanted systems offer the clearest signal but require surgery. Non-invasive approaches are safer but noisier and need heavier processing. Both paths are improving fast because computing power and algorithms have gotten dramatically better and cheaper. Safety matters. Surgical implants create risks of infection and scarring. Long-term effects are not fully known. Regulators insist on careful trials and monitoring, yet private money often moves faster than public oversight. Beyond safety, the core worry is control. The raw electrical data is unintelligible without models that translate it. Those models are trained on personal data. That training creates a mapping between your brain patterns and actions or words. The mapping is valuable. It could help someone trapped by paralysis speak again. It could also become a new target for advertisers, employers, or governments. So the technical story is clear. Brains can be read well enough to act on intention and speech. The social story is unresolved. Who owns your neural mapping, and who can listen in will decide whether programmable reality means empowerment for people or new ways for power to reach inside the mind. The Human Brain Project. Scientists decided to do something bold. They would try to recreate the brain on computers and supercomputers and see what happens. The idea starts simple. Take the parts the brain uses and model them in code. Neurons become units that send signals. Connections become maps that weigh those signals. The project aimed to stitch these pieces into a working whole to study learning memory and disease. Scale matters. The real human brain has roughly 86 billion neurons and about 100 trillion connections. Simulating even a tiny slice forces engineers to invent faster software and clever shortcuts. Early milestones included recreating a neocortical column and running detailed tissue models to test how networks fire. Why does that feel like programming reality? Because behaviors that once seemed purely biological began to appear in code. Models showed learning like pattern recognition and circuit failures that matched real disease patterns. That meant researchers could flip variables in a simulated brain and watch effects that would be costly or impossible to test in people. Those results do not mean a full mind sits inside a machine today. They do mean that parts of cognition are tractable and testable. The work also spun off unexpected tools. High-resolution brain atlases and data sets made experiments reproducible across labs and fed new artificial intelligence approaches. So the technical payoff is clear. We can model brain parts and predict some behaviors. The deeper question is darker. As models get more accurate, how close will code come to producing experience, and who decides when a simulation crosses that line? Those simulation breakthroughs produced tools that matter outside the lab. Drug teams used models to predict how circuits fail in disease, and to test interventions without risking patients. That cut development time and made some trials cheaper and faster. Engineers also translated simulation ideas into specialized hardware. Neuromorphic machines mimic neural wiring and run brain-like tasks more efficiently than ordinary processors. One recent system reached the scale of billions of artificial neurons and pushed researchers to rethink how to build intelligent machines. Practical gains come with heavy costs. Large-scale simulations need huge computing power and energy. That limits who can run them and who benefits. Wealthy labs and powerful state actors already have the resources. Small universities and clinics often cannot. Accuracy is another problem. Models simplify. They can reproduce patterns and predict certain failures, but they leave out many unknowns. A simulation might model memory like behavior without producing any inner experience. Or it might get close enough that the question becomes uncomfortable. That is the heart of the ethical tension. If a model begins to behave like a mind, does it deserve moral consideration? If simulated pain appears in code, how should scientists respond? Policy and law lag behind the pace of experiments. Private funding can accelerate breakthroughs, but it can also steer what questions get asked. So the technical takeaway is clear. We can model and test parts of the brain in ways that change medicine and engineering. The social takeaway is urgent. Who builds the maps, who runs the simulations, and who decides whether a model counts as a mind will shape whether programmable reality helps people or creates new forms of harm. Allen Institute for Brain Science. A team created maps so detailed you can follow gene activity across layers of tissue like streets on a city map. Those atlases began with small brains and scaled up. Researchers sliced tissue thinly and measured which genes lit up in each cell. They traced which cells connected to which, and stored all of that in searchable databases that labs everywhere can use. The practical results arrived fast. Drug teams used map data to find where disease-related genes cluster. That let them test candidate drugs against precise cell types instead of guessing. Clinics studying neurodegeneration found patterns that matched patient symptoms and suggested new intervention points. Mapping also improved basic science. Scientists could compare gene activity across regions and ages and discover gradients that explain perception and emotion. That insight fed better models and even new machine learning approaches inspired by real brain layouts. Public access changed the game. Open data meant independent teams and small labs could run experiments without owning giant machines. But open data is not the whole story. High-resolution mapping needs expensive equipment and expertise. Wealthy institutions still lead the most daring projects and set priorities. Ethical questions multiply. Maps make targets you can aim at. That helps medicine, but it also creates tools for modulation and control. Who decides which circuits get altered and who benefits from the resulting therapies are political choices, not scientific ones. So, mapping turned biological tissue into reusable engineering data. The maps make intervention possible. The choice of what to change will decide whether programmable reality heals people or hands more power to a few. They turned brain tissue into searchable maps that labs can use like tools in a workshop. Researchers slice tissue thin and measure which genes each cell reads. They trace cell connections and tag the results in huge databases. The maps let scientists find where disease-related genes cluster and test drugs against the exact cell types that matter. One practical win came when teams used map data to predict how a circuit would fail in degeneration, and then tested candidate molecules in cell cultures. That sped discovery and avoided costly blind trials. Other groups used mapping to link gene activity to perception and emotion and to build better models for artificial intelligence. Open access changed the landscape. When data is public, small labs and citizen scientists can contribute meaningfully without owning giant machines. Yet, high-resolution mapping still needs expensive microscopes, sequencing rigs, and expert teams. The biggest projects often sit inside wealthy institutions and foundations that set what gets mapped and when. Maps also create targets. Once you can point to a cluster of cells that drive a symptom, you can design interventions to change their behavior. That helps patients, but it also raises hard questions about modulation and consent. Who decides which circuits should be altered for the sake of productivity, mood, or longevity? So, mapping made the brain legible and actionable. The science gave us new therapy paths and new engineering tools. The political choice of what to change and who benefits remains unsettled. Chan Zuckerberg BioHub, a lab where engineers and biologists hand the messy parts of life to algorithms and get back clear designs. Imagine a team facing a stubborn disease target. Traditionally, they test thousands of molecules the hard way. Now they feed data into machine learning models, and the models suggest a handful of promising designs in days instead of months. Those models learn patterns in proteins and genes and predict which changes will work. Recent advances made that practical. Protein folding predictors, such as AlphaFold 3, turned structure prediction from guesswork into a repeatable tool. Other AI platforms design molecules that bind precisely to targets. Industry partnerships show the payoff. Companies used AI models to cut the time to identify candidate therapeutics and to improve early-stage success rates. That speed matters for patients and for markets. Faster design lowers cost and gets treatments into trials sooner. It also changes who can build a solution. Teams with the best models and the largest data sets move faster. Wealthy labs and private partnerships often have both. The BioHub-style approach is powerful because it treats biology like software you can iterate on with data-driven tools. That makes living systems easier to engineer. It also makes control a core question. If an algorithm decides which genes to tweak, who reviews the decision and who gets the resulting therapy? So the technical proof is plain. AI can design biological interventions that work in the lab. The social choice is not yet settled. Who owns the models, who sets the priorities, and who gets the lifeline of faster cures will shape whether programmable biology serves everyone or only the wealthy few. Teams showed the promise beyond the lab bench. AI designed candidate proteins that bound precisely to targets in cell tests, and some of those candidates moved into animal trials faster than traditional efforts would allow. Companies reported cutting months and sometimes years from early-stage discovery. The models work because they learn from vast, messy data. Structure predictors map how proteins fold. Design engines test millions of virtual tweaks. That lets scientists focus on a few high-probability leads instead of chasing thousands of blind guesses. Partnerships between labs and industry put those models into practice and into clinics faster. That speed has clear human benefit. Faster candidates mean earlier trials and quicker answers for patients waiting for treatments. It also lowers costs in the long run and opens new paths for rare and complex diseases that were previously too slow to pursue. At the same time, the system concentrates advantage. High-quality models need huge datasets and specialized compute. Wealthy institutions and private firms control those resources. That creates an uneven playing field where the labs with the best models set research priorities and decide which conditions receive attention. Regulation lags behind innovation. Data privacy rules and trial oversight are catching up, but the business incentives push for speed. Models trained on proprietary patient data produce proprietary designs. That raises questions about transparency and fairness. So the technical proof is striking. Algorithms can write biological fixes that work in experiments. The social proof is missing. Who owns the models, who decides research priorities, and who gets the first cures will determine whether programmable biology becomes shared progress or another advantage for the few. Simulation hypothesis. Some of the richest people in tech have spent serious money to study whether reality could be engineered or simulated. One backer put up $1 billion to build new brain research at top universities. That institute funds labs that study perception consciousness and how brains generate a sense of reality. Another investor matched funds for organizations thinking about long-term artificial intelligence and whether advanced simulating systems could exist. He also backed early efforts to build safe general intelligence. One entrepreneur went public with a blunt argument. He said the odds are so skewed by our rapid tech progress that living inside a simulation might be more likely than not. His comment pushed a wave of public interest and private funding into projects that test the idea in practical ways. So, what does testing the idea look like in the lab? Researchers do not try to break out of a cosmic game. They study the building blocks of perception and the limits of computation. They create high-fidelity simulations of neural circuits. They ask whether a simulated system can reproduce key features of conscious behavior. Those experiments produce measurable outcomes. A simulation that reproduces a pattern of perception gives researchers a way to control variables precisely and test theories about how experience arises. That turns philosophy into experiments you can run and repeat. The money matters because large-scale simulation and consciousness work are expensive. Supercomputers and long-term funding change what questions get asked and who answers them. Private donors can steer entire fields toward testing whether reality behaves like code. So, the technical result is surprising. Parts of perception and consciousness can be modeled and probed like engineered systems. The big question is political. When reality becomes a research program funded by a few who decides which parts of the program run and which stay off. Labs turned abstract ideas into measurable tests. Teams built simulated neural circuits and then compared how those circuits responded to the same inputs as living tissue. When a simulated circuit reacted like a real one, researchers could change a single parameter in code and watch the virtual response. That gave them a level of control impossible in living systems. Some results were striking. Models reproduced timing patterns in perception and predicted which disruptions would cause specific deficits. Those predictions held up when teams tested them on tissue or simple animals. The experiments did not produce conscious beings in code. They did produce reliable rules that link physical structure to experience-like responses. Limits are important. Simulations simplify. They leave out chemistry and slow body signals that shape real minds. A model that matches some behavior does not prove the model experiences anything. That distinction matters for ethics and for claims about reality being entirely programmable. Money changes the questions that get asked. Supercomputers and long-term funding make expensive experiments possible. When a few donors underwrite large-scale simulation work, they shape priorities and timelines. Public research that studies everyday harms can lose out to high-prestige projects that probe philosophical ends. The science gives tools. The funding gives direction. The methods show parts of perception are engineerable. The remaining question is political. DARPA. Soldiers trained to move without speaking, while devices listen for the signals linked to speech and intention. That is the core idea. DARPA-funded experiments turned into testable tools. One program tracked the tiny electrical patterns that happen when someone silently forms speech. The system did not read words at first. It found reliable patterns that matched subvocal signals and used machine learning to translate them into messages under controlled conditions. Another effort merged neural data with sensor feeds to warn of threats faster than human eyes alone. The Cognitive Technology Threat Warning System combined brain monitoring with image analysis and flagged anomalies that operators then checked. In trials, the system helped spot hidden targets that casual observation missed. Researchers also developed algorithms that isolate behavior-related signals and give real-time feedback. The Army Research Laboratory built models that detect fatigue and stress patterns. That can be useful to prevent accidents. It can also change how commanders assess readiness and assign tasks. These are technical proofs, not science fiction. They show neural signals can be decoded enough to support silent communication, threat alerts, and behavioral feedback. Each result came from careful experiments with volunteers under strict protocols. But the implications escalate quickly. Military labs move technology toward operational use. Once a capability proves reliable in a battlefield test, it can migrate into surveillance, detention centers, or even workplace monitoring. The line between enhancing and controlling a person blurs when neural mappings become part of routine systems. So, the technical takeaway is clear. Decoding and acting on neural patterns works enough to change outcomes. The social takeaway is urgent. When defense dollars shape who gets tested and how those tools are used, who decides the rules matters as much as the capability itself. In tests, the tools moved from lab demos to field trials. Engineers shrank sensors and improved signal clarity so systems could run in real time. That turned a controlled proof into an operational possibility. Silent communication became more than a thought experiment. Systems trained on subvocal patterns could relay short messages under limited vocab and structured settings. Threat warning tools combined brain signals with cameras and radar and flagged anomalies faster than human teams alone. Behavioral feedback algorithms learned to spot fatigue and stress before visible signs appeared. Those wins created demand. Military planners saw advantages in stealth coordination, faster decision cycles, and improved soldier safety. Contractors raced to integrate neural modules into helmets and vehicle stations. Funding flowed from research accounts into prototype development and deployment pilots. Dual use is the key risk. Technologies built for the battlefield rarely stay there. Once refined, they can be applied to border security, crowd control, or workplace monitoring. Data collected for readiness can become data used for surveillance. Proprietary models trained on sensitive neural data become assets with commercial and political value. Rules lag behind technology. Existing ethics reviews cover human subjects but struggle with persistent neural monitoring and the downstream use of neural mappings. International law and arms control frameworks do not yet address neural surveillance or automated cognitive intervention. That regulatory gap creates a race between technical capability and governance. There are practical safeguards, open audits, strict limits on data retention, and independent oversight can reduce abuse. Civil society and lawmakers must act now because once mappings and models exist, they are hard to unmake. So the technical fact stands. Military-funded work proved neural patterns can be decoded and acted upon in ways that matter. The urgent political question remains: who writes the rules for using tools that can reach inside a human mind and change behavior? Physerum polycephalum, a yellow, creeping blob in a petri dish, can find the shortest path through a maze, and it does it without a brain. Put food at 2 points and watch. The organism spreads a network of tubes. Over hours, the tubes rearrange until the most efficient route carries the most flow. That simple behavior matches what computer scientists call the shortest path problem. Researchers use that trick to mimic city transit networks and to test optimization rules. They placed nutrient points where train stations would be, and the slime mold built a network that looked strikingly like the Tokyo rail system. The result is not magic. It is a living process that balances resource flow and risk. Engineers turned the same behavior into logical gates. By manipulating light and nutrients, they coax tubes to form or break connections, creating basic on and off operations. Others proposed using the constantly changing network as a source of cryptographic keys. The unpredictability of a living system makes it hard to reproduce without the original conditions. Models also exposed a bigger idea. The slime mold outsources computation to its environment. It uses chemistry and flow to solve problems that would be costly for silicon to compute. That suggests a hybrid future where biology and machines work together. There are limits and dangers. Living computers are slow and messy compared with chips. They can also mutate or react to contaminants in unpredictable ways. Scaling them for real-world use faces practical hurdles. Still, the proof is clear. Life can compute. The question that follows is political. Researchers turned curiosity into prototypes that point to real uses. One idea is low-energy routing. Sensors made with living networks could reconfigure themselves to reroute signals when parts fail. That is useful in remote monitoring, where power is scarce. Another path is sensing and encryption. The living network responds to chemicals, light, and temperature in unique ways. Those responses can act as signatures. Engineers proposed using them to generate keys that are hard to clone, because the living substrate is sensitive to tiny environmental differences. Hybrid systems are already plausible. Imagine a conventional chip that offloads a specific optimization step to a living module. The chip handles fast arithmetic. The living module explores the best network layout under changing conditions. The two together use less energy than a pure silicon solution for some tasks. There are practical hurdles. Living modules are slow compared with chips. They need food and clean conditions. They can mutate or react to microbes that change behavior. Repeatability is a major challenge for safety-critical systems. There are also ethical and regulatory issues. Who owns a biological key that cannot be duplicated? What happens when a living sensor dies and the data vanishes? And who is responsible if an engineered living network triggers harm by spreading where it should not? Funding shapes the answers. Wealthy labs can build controlled environments and proprietary systems. Public labs and community scientists can explore open uses. That split decides whether living computation becomes a public toolbox or a gated advantage. So the proof stands that life can compute in useful ways. The pressing question is not technical, it is political. Citizen science. People playing simple games on a laptop helped optimize real quantum experiments and beat solutions protracted by experts. Quantum moves let volunteers move atoms in a game like puzzle. Players found strategies that automated optimizers missed. Researchers then took the human-derived moves and applied them to an ultra-cold atom setup. The result improved control sequences in a fraction of the time experts had needed. Other projects repeated the idea. Decadoku turned quantum error correction into a puzzle. Mequonics asked players to untangle knot-like structures that map to algorithmic routines. Remote interfaces let citizen scientists tune real apparatus in real time. In some tests, crowdsourced solutions reached or exceeded expert performance for specific tasks. Why did this work? Humans bring intuition and pattern recognition that complements brute force computation. When the search space is weird or the objective is hard to formalize, humans explore paths algorithms avoid. In effect, the crowd expanded the toolbox available to experimental teams. That outcome matters for programmable reality. It means control over quantum systems is not only a matter for elite labs with supercomputers. Distributed human insight can shorten development cycles and change who contributes key breakthroughs. But practical limits remain. Not every quantum problem suits human play. Many tasks still need heavy compute and deep expertise. And there is a thorny social question. When volunteers supply winning strategies, who owns the resulting protocols and the intellectual property that flows from them? So, the technical proof is plain. Crowds can program parts of quantum experiments. The political question is now urgent. That public success spawned a mix of celebration and awkward questions. Some volunteer moves became the basis for patented control protocols. In a few cases, research teams added those human-derived methods to proprietary toolkits that powered follow-up work. Community members pushed back. They said their intuition and hours of play deserved credit and a share of the value. Scientists argued that citizen contributions are part of open research, and that formal ownership would have slowed the rapid exchange of ideas. The deeper issue is who translates human insight into usable algorithms, and then who locks those algorithms behind licenses. Crowds supply creativity, labs supply validation and scale. The gap between the two can become a wedge where public good turns into private advantage. There are models to bridge that gap. Open licenses that guarantee attribution and shared use can let volunteers benefit, without blocking downstream development. Prize-based models and cooperative ownership let communities retain stake while still partnering with well-resourced teams. Practical limits matter too. Many quantum problems still need heavy compute or custom hardware. Crowd solutions work best when the search space matches human intuition. For the hardest problems, elite compute remains necessary. The social lesson is simple. When ordinary people help program a part of reality, they gain moral standing to judge how the results are used. That standing should become legal and institutional power, not just a talking point. So the result is clear. The public can help program experiments. The urgent question is political. Programmable Rydberg atom quantum simulators. In one striking experiment, researchers arranged 51 rubidium atoms, like beads on a string, and then tuned how strongly each atom pushed on its neighbor. They slowly changed the control lasers so the chain passed through a phase transition. Theory says that when a system crosses a critical point, defects will form, and the number of defects follows a simple scaling law. That is the Kibble-Zurich mechanism. The team measured how correlation lengths grew as they ramped across the transition. The results matched predictions. The scaling looked like the universal patterns physicists expected, roughly following a 1/2 exponent for that class of transition. In plain language, the simulator behaved like the math said it would. Other labs reproduced the idea in different hardware. Semiconductor charge qubits using Landau Zener sweeps showed similar Kibble-Zurich-like behavior. Experiments even found ways to suppress defect formation by biasing symmetry, giving engineers a shortcut toward smoother transitions. Why does this matter? It proves you can program many body dynamics in a lab and get predictable outcomes. That turns exotic theory into an engineering toolkit. You can design states of matter with specific defects or get rid of them when you want. The payoff is huge for quantum computing material science and precision simulation. The unsettling part is political. They also learned how to steer the process. By adding a small bias during the transition, researchers suppressed defects that normally form. That is like nudging a row of falling dominoes so fewer of them topple. Engineers used that trick to make smoother state changes. In practical terms, smoother changes mean fewer errors in a quantum device and more reliable operations. That matters for devices where tiny defects spoil a calculation. The experiments gave more than proof, they provided tools. Teams developed pulse sequences and control patterns that other labs can copy. Those sequences are practical recipes. They let engineers build states of matter with desired properties on demand. One clear application is quantum computing. Controlling defect formation helps prepare cleaner initial states and reduces the cost of error correction. Another is materials science. Programmable transitions let researchers explore new phases that could have unusual properties for sensors or energy applications. There are technical hurdles to scale. Arrays of neutral atoms work well for controlled tests. But scaling to the problem sizes needed for large machines remains very hard. Hardware variation and noise still limit how far the methods can go right now. The experiments also changed physics practice. A theoretical idea from decades ago became an experimental tool for engineering. That shift means physicists now design experiments with the goal of control, not just discovery. Control becomes a form of knowledge. That brings us back to the core claim. These labs showed you can program many body dynamics and get predictable outcomes. That turns parts of reality into an engineering problem. The choice about which behaviors to program is not just technical. It is a social decision. Who decides which phases we build and which we ban will shape not only technology, but the limits of what is possible for everyone.